HOA sued me for my barn. Then I showed the survey, and their clubhouse sat on my land. What happens when an HOA takes someone to court over a barn, only for a survey to raise questions about the land beneath its own clubhouse? How could a property dispute turn completely around? Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the channel. We are glad to have you here for another unforgettable story. Before we begin, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our upcoming stories. Thank you for spending your time with us and for continuing to watch, share, and support the channel. We truly appreciate every one of you. Before we start, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? Let's begin the story. 18 feet, Cynthia Bradford said, tapping the subdivision map with one polished fingernail. That is how far your barn crosses into Silver Pines property. I set my impact wrench on the workbench and listened to its metal casing click against the scarred oak. A minute earlier, the barn had been filled with the sharp chatter of the tool, the smell of motor oil, and the dry sweetness of old lumber. Now all I could hear was gravel shifting beneath Cynthia's shoes outside the open doors. It was 6:40 in the morning, and she had arrived with a property manager, a leather folder, and the kind of expression people wear when they believe the argument is already over. My name is Daniel Mercer. I was 49 years old, and I made my living repairing agricultural equipment on 8.7 acres that had been in my family long before Silver Pines Estates appeared beside us. The red barn behind me was where I rebuilt mower decks, repaired hydraulic pumps, and occasionally brought an old tractor back to life. My father had built most of it decades earlier. Cynthia held out a legal notice. The association has given you multiple opportunities to resolve this voluntarily. I wiped my hands on a shop rag before taking it. Silver Pines claimed my barn violated a common area setback and extended 18 feet across what their documents identified as an association-controlled buffer. They wanted the encroachment removed, my equipment activity stopped, and their enforcement expenses paid. That barn was standing before your clubhouse existed, I said. Cynthia gave me a patient smile. Property lines do not care how old your barn is. That sentence stayed with me. She opened the subdivision map across the hood of her white sport utility vehicle. The drawing looked professional. Lot numbers, bearings, common areas. A heavy boundary line running near my western acreage. According to that line, the back corner of my barn sat on the wrong side. I leaned closer. 18 feet was not a rounding error. If the map was right, I had a serious problem. Where did this line come from? I asked. The recorded development plan. And you verified it against my deed? Her smile tightened. Our attorney has reviewed the association records. She closed the map and told me the lawsuit would proceed unless I agreed to remove the encroachment. Then she drove away, leaving 2 pale tire tracks in the morning dust. I stood beside the barn holding the notice while sunlight climbed across the faded red siding. Near the tree line, half hidden beneath honeysuckle and years of leaves, was an old iron survey pin my father had shown me when I was a teenager. I could still hear him saying, "That is the corner, Danny. Never let anybody move it." I had barely thought about that pin in 30 years. By noon, I had called Lauren Hayes, a property attorney in town. She read the complaint while I sat across from her desk, then looked at the subdivision map Cynthia had given me. They made the boundary part of their case, she said. That means we do not start by arguing about your barn. We start by establishing the boundary. 2 days later, surveyor Mark Reynolds arrived with a tripod, receiver, field tablet, and copies of my recorded deed. He found the old iron pin exactly where my father remembered it. The receiver chirped as Mark took the first measurement. Then another. He stared at the screen longer than I expected. What? I asked. He looked toward my barn, then across the manicured grass beyond my property toward the stone clubhouse of Silver Pines. Their line does not close. Cynthia had sued me over 18 feet of land. What she did not know was that we were about to keep measuring. The first time I really understood how much the land had changed, I was standing beside Mark Reynolds while his survey receiver chirped over a corner my father had treated as permanent. When I was a kid, there was no Silver Pines estates beyond that iron pin. There was pasture, a narrow drainage swale, and a line of hardwoods that turned orange every October. My father, Walter Mercer, worked the acreage with the practical patience of a man who believed fences, deeds, and tools should all be maintained before they became problems. The red barn had been his biggest project. He poured the footings with 2 friends, framed the walls himself, and painted the siding a deep farm red that summer sun eventually faded. By the time the surrounding acreage was sold to developers, the barn already looked old. Silver pines arrived gradually. First came survey flags, then grading equipment, then paved streets, decorative stone entrance columns, trimmed lawns, and rows of houses where pasture had been. The clubhouse came later, built on the western side near what the developer called a common recreational area. I never cared much about it. My 8.7 acres remained separate, and I kept repairing equipment the same way I always had. The trouble started after Cynthia Bradford became association president. At first, her complaints had nothing to do with property lines. She said residents could hear my pneumatic tools. Then she objected to 2 tractors waiting outside the barn for repairs. Another notice called the equipment visible from silver pines an appearance concern. I answered each one the same way. My land was not governed by their architectural rules, and my work complied with county requirements. Cynthia did not like that answer. A month later, the argument changed. Instead of claiming my barn looked wrong, Silver Pines claimed part of it was actually sitting on land controlled by the association. That was harder to dismiss. Now, standing beside Mark, I watched him compare my deed calls with Cynthia's development map. He walked toward the barn, stopped near the rear corner, recorded another point, then returned to the iron pin. "Your barn is not 18 feet across their line," he said. I felt some pressure leave my chest. So their map is wrong. Something is wrong. I am not signing anything until I know what. He showed me the screen. The bearings from my recorded deed connected with the physical monument and an older fence alignment farther north. The Silver Pines map shifted the western boundary inward toward my barn. Mark moved through the brush until he found remnants of that old fence, weathered posts almost swallowed by vines. He measured again. The numbers supported my deed. Then he extended the verified bearing south. The receiver chirped as he crossed from rough grass onto the manicured edge of Silver Pines. I followed several yards behind him. Automatic sprinklers clicked across the lawn. Fresh mulch surrounded ornamental shrubs near the clubhouse patio. Mark stopped, checked his tablet, and walked another few feet. "Daniel," he said quietly, "I need a second field session before I tell you what this means." His caution worried me more than excitement would have. The next morning he returned with additional control data and repeated everything. Iron monument, old fence alignment, recorded bearings, distances. My barn remained safely inside my acreage. But the same line did not stop at the barn. It continued across the landscaped strip toward the association property. I watched Mark place a temporary survey flag in the grass. From where I stood, I could see the stone clubhouse less than 100 feet ahead. Cynthia had spent weeks insisting that her map proved where my property ended. Mark was now following the monuments that showed where it actually ended, and every measurement was taking him closer to the most expensive building Silver Pines owned. By the third survey visit, I stopped thinking about Cynthia's 18 feet and started wondering how Silver Pines had drawn its line in the first place. Mark would not speculate. That was one thing I liked about him. He trusted monuments, bearings, distances, and recorded documents more than anyone's confidence. He spent most of that morning checking the northern control point, walking the old fence alignment, and repeating measurements from the iron pin my father had shown me decades earlier. Each time, the result landed within inches of the previous reading. My barn stayed comfortably inside my property. The association's development map did not. I called Lauren Hayes from the barn while Mark worked. "So they sued me using the wrong boundary," I said. "Maybe," she answered. "Do not reduce this to a bad map yet. We need to know what they relied on, when they relied on it, and whether another recorded document changes what Mark is seeing." That afternoon, Lauren requested the development records Silver Pines had used to establish the Western Common Area boundary. She also requested the clubhouse construction plat, acquisition documents, permits, engineering records, and any final boundary verification completed before construction. Cynthia apparently heard about those requests quickly. The following morning, she drove onto my gravel entrance while I was replacing a hydraulic hose on an old green tractor. She stayed beside her vehicle instead of approaching the barn. "I understand you hired a surveyor." I wiped my hands with a shop rag. "Your lawsuit says this is a boundary dispute. The association already has recorded plans. Then another survey should not bother you." Her expression remained controlled, but she looked beyond me toward the temporary flags Mark had placed near the western edge. Those markers should not be placed on association property without permission. I almost answered immediately, then remembered Lauren's advice. Let the documents speak first. Mark knows where he is authorized to work. Cynthia opened her leather folder and handed me another copy of the development plan. This is the boundary Silver Pines recognizes. I looked at the heavy line running toward my barn. Did anyone verify that line against the original monuments? Our professionals handled the development. She closed the folder. You should focus on resolving the barn issue before your legal expenses increase. She left without asking why the new flags were nowhere near the barn. That told me she still believed the dispute ended at my workshop wall. 2 days later, Mark called me to the clubhouse side of the property. Morning sprinklers had left beads of water across the grass, and the stone veneer was still dark with moisture near the patio. Mark had completed his independent checks. He showed me the certified working overlay. The verified deed line crossed the landscape strip, continued through the edge of the parking area, passed beneath part of the patio, and reached the clubhouse footprint itself. I stared at the screen, then at the building. How much? Enough that nobody should make assumptions until title counsel reviews everything. Lauren arrived an hour later. She studied the measurements without smiling. We verify this from every direction, she said. The records began arriving that week. Most were ordinary construction documents, but buried in an engineering file was a note printed beside the clubhouse foundation plan. Verify west property line prior to foundation. Lauren searched the production twice. There was no signed final verification attached. No certification showing the developer had completed that instruction. I stood at her conference table looking at those 6 words. Cynthia had accused my barn of crossing a line by 18 feet. Her own construction file contained a warning to verify that same line before the clubhouse foundation was built. Someone had written the warning. What we still did not know was whether anyone had listened. The missing verification became the first thing Lauren wanted answered and the last thing she wanted Cynthia to know we cared about. She told me not to confront anyone, not to move a survey flag, and definitely not to walk into the clubhouse waving Mark's overlay like I had already won something. A survey is evidence, she said. Let them commit to their own evidence first. Silver Pines had already done part of that by suing me, but Lauren wanted the record cleaner. She sent their attorney a formal request asking the association to identify the exact boundary it claimed separated my acreage from the common area. 3 days later, their response arrived. They relied on the development plan Cynthia had shown me beside my barn. Lauren followed with another question. What monument, recorded bearing, or field verification supported that line? Their attorney referenced the same plan and historical association records. Nothing about the iron pin. Nothing about the old fence alignment. Nothing about a final field certification. Then Cynthia signed an affidavit stating that Silver Pines had consistently recognized the development plan boundary and that my barn extended approximately 18 feet into the association-controlled buffer. I read that sentence twice at Lauren's office. She signed it. Lauren nodded. Yes. Even after she saw Mark surveying near the clubhouse. She saw flags. She does not know what they establish. Lauren placed the affidavit beside Mark's preliminary certified work. Now we know exactly what she is asking the court to believe. Discovery continued. The clubhouse construction file was older than Cynthia's presidency, so I did not expect her name to appear in it. What mattered was the developer's process. We found grading plans, drainage calculations, utility drawings, landscaping layouts, and foundation dimensions. Again and again, the clubhouse location was shown relative to the development boundary, but the engineering note remained there like a loose thread. Verify west property line prior to foundation. Lauren requested the missing verification specifically. Silver Pines answered that no additional responsive document had been located. Mark completed his final fieldwork the following Monday. I followed him from the iron pin through the rough grass toward the manicured common area. His receiver gave the same steady chirp at each point. The line cleared my barn. It crossed the landscape strip. It clipped the parking area. Then it passed across the patio and into the clubhouse footprint. Mark drove no permanent stakes near the building. Instead, he documented coordinates, photographs, monument references, and measurements for the certified survey. When he handed Lauren the finished copy, she studied it silently for almost a minute. This is what we file. Silver Pines reacted within 48 hours. Their attorney proposed a settlement. The association would withdraw the barn removal demand, waive its enforcement expenses, and recognize the existing structure if I dismissed any claims concerning the western boundary. The wording was careful. They never mentioned the clubhouse. They did not need to. I sat at my workbench that evening with the offer beside an oily shop rag. Outside, rain tapped against the barn roof, and the faded red doors shuddered lightly whenever the wind shifted. A month earlier, keeping the barn was all I wanted. Now they were offering exactly that, but only if I agreed to stop asking where my land actually ended. I called Lauren. They know. They know there is risk, she corrected. That is not the same as admitting the survey is right. I declined the offer. The next morning, Cynthia's white sport utility vehicle slowed near my driveway, but did not turn in. For the first time since this started, she did not bring me a notice, a map, or a warning. She simply looked toward the barn and kept driving. The irony was impossible to miss. Silver Pines had taken me to court because they wanted a legal answer about one building crossing a property line. We finally had the certified measurements. The only question left was whether they still wanted the judge to see them. The certified survey changed the way Lauren prepared for court. Until then, every document had been defensive. My deed defended my acreage. The iron pin defended the old corner. The historical fence line defended the bearing. Mark's field measurements defended the barn. Now Lauren began building the other half of the case, the part Silver Pines had accidentally created when it asked a judge to declare where the boundary belonged. She filed Mark's survey and answered the association's complaint point by point. The barn did not extend 18 feet into their common buffer. It did not extend 1 foot into it. According to the recorded deed, surviving monuments, historical alignment, and certified field measurements, the barn stood entirely on my property. Then came the counterclaim. Lauren kept the language restrained. We were not demanding that anyone tear down the clubhouse. We were asking the court to determine the true boundary and address whatever encroachment that determination established. Silver Pines responded quickly. Their attorney challenged Mark's conclusions and argued that the development plan reflected the boundary used for years. Mark answered with numbers. A plan could draw a line anywhere. A boundary survey had to reconcile the deed, monuments, bearings, distances, and field evidence. Cynthia's affidavit became more important because she had sworn that the development plan line accurately established the association boundary. Lauren placed it in the trial binder directly behind the map. Do not underestimate how useful consistency is, she told me. They picked their line. We are going to let Mark show the court where that line fails. A week before the hearing, Silver Pines made another offer. This one went farther. They would dismiss the lawsuit, waive every claimed fee, permanently recognize my barn, and contribute toward my legal expenses if both sides signed a confidential boundary agreement. Lauren read the proposed description and immediately noticed what it did. It effectively moved the disputed line to protect the clubhouse without admitting that the existing deed line crossed the association property. They want you to solve their title problem privately, she said. I looked through her office window toward the courthouse 2 blocks away. They sued me because they wanted the boundary settled. Exactly. We rejected it. The following afternoon, I returned to the barn and found Cynthia waiting near the gravel entrance. No property manager. No leather folder. Just Cynthia standing beside her white sport utility vehicle with her arms loosely folded. This has gone far beyond what anyone intended, she said. I set down the toolbox I was carrying. I intended to keep my barn. And you can. That was not your offer when this started. She looked toward the clubhouse roof visible beyond the trees. There are homeowners who had nothing to do with this dispute. They should not suffer because of an old surveying issue. For the first time, she called it a surveying issue instead of an encroaching barn. I understood why. I am not asking anyone to suffer, I said. I am asking for the line to be accurate. Cynthia studied me for several seconds. There are reasonable ways to settle these things. There were reasonable ways before you sued me. She left without answering. The morning before court, Mark met Lauren and me for one final review. He placed the survey across the conference table and traced the boundary with his finger. First the iron pin, then the old fence alignment, then the deed bearing, then my barn, safely inside the line. His finger continued south across the landscaped strip, the edge of the parking area, the patio, and finally the clubhouse footprint. If the judge asks where the line goes, Lauren said, do not explain the lawsuit. Do not explain Cynthia. Just explain the survey. Mark nodded. That night, I closed the barn doors and looked across the dark acreage toward the clubhouse lights glowing through the trees. Cynthia had started this case with a map showing my building 18 feet over her line. In the morning, a judge was finally going to see what happened when that line was measured from the ground instead of drawn from a conference table. The courthouse smelled faintly of floor polish, paper, and coffee that had been sitting too long. I arrived 20 minutes early with Lauren and found Cynthia already seated behind the association's attorney. She wore a cream blazer and kept a closed leather folder beside her, but the confidence I remembered from my barn driveway had changed. She no longer looked like someone waiting for an obvious rule to be enforced. She looked like someone waiting to see which document the judge would believe. Silver Pines presented its case first. Their attorney displayed the development plan and explained that the association had relied on the same boundary configuration for years. Then photographs of my barn appeared on a monitor. Faded red siding, gravel apron, equipment near the doors. Cynthia testified that the structure extended approximately 18 feet into the common buffer shown on the association plan. Lauren did not interrupt the story. She waited until cross-examination. Ms. Bradford, you signed an affidavit stating that this development plan accurately represents the Western Association boundary? Yes. Did you personally verify that boundary against the original monuments? Cynthia paused. I relied on the association's professional records. Did you locate the iron monument referenced in Mr. Mercer's deed? No. Lauren placed the engineering document on the screen. Were you aware that the clubhouse foundation plan contained an instruction to verify the west property line before construction? Cynthia looked toward her attorney. I was not present when the clubhouse was built. I understand. Did Silver Pines produce a completed verification? Not that I am aware of. Then Mark Reynolds took the stand. His explanation was almost painfully simple. He started with my recorded deed. He identified the surviving iron monument. He explained the historical fence alignment and the recorded bearing. He described repeating the measurements through multiple field sessions before certifying anything. Lauren displayed his survey beside the development plan. Where is Mr. Mercer's barn relative to the verified deed boundary? Mark pointed. Entirely within Mr. Mercer's parcel. The judge leaned forward. Not 18 feet across. No, Your Honor. Silver Pines' attorney challenged the old monument and suggested development records reflected the practical boundary accepted for years. Mark returned to the deed calls. The monument fit. The historical alignment fit. The measured distances fit. The association line was the element that failed to reconcile. Then Lauren asked the question I had been waiting for. Mr. Reynolds, if you continue the verified western boundary south from the monument, where does it go? Mark traced the line across the survey. Rough grass first, then the manicured common area, the edge of the parking lot, the patio. His finger stopped over the clubhouse footprint. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The judge looked from the survey to Silver Pines' attorney. Am I reading this correctly? Mark answered. A portion of the clubhouse and associated improvements lies within the parcel described by Mr. Mercer's deed. Cynthia stared at the screen. The same kind of straight boundary line she had once tapped with her fingernail was now running through the building behind her authority. Their attorney asked for clarification about tolerances. Mark explained that the result was not a matter of inches. Independent checks produced the same boundary. Lauren then showed the missing verification note again. The judge asked Silver Pines whether it had any final survey from the clubhouse construction establishing a different recorded boundary. Their attorney requested a moment to review the file. Papers turned. Quiet whispers passed across their table. No document appeared. I sat with my hands folded, remembering Cynthia standing beside my workbench saying property lines did not care how old a barn was. She had been absolutely right about that. The judge finally looked toward both sides and said the court was prepared to determine the boundary from the evidence presented. The lawsuit had begun with Silver Pines asking him to decide which building crossed the line. For the first time that morning, nobody at their table seemed eager to hear the answer. The judge did not announce his decision immediately. Instead, he asked both attorneys to walk through the boundary evidence one final time, beginning with the oldest recorded description and ending with the modern development plan. Lauren started with my deed. The iron monument was referenced through the historical chain, the bearing aligned with the surviving fence remnants, and Mark's repeated measurements closed consistently. Silver Pines returned to the development plan, arguing that the neighborhood had relied on that configuration since construction. The judge studied both documents for several minutes before looking at their attorney. "Reliance explains conduct," he said. "It does not relocate a deed boundary." Cynthia lowered her eyes toward the table. The court accepted Mark's certified survey as the controlling evidence of the disputed line. My barn stood entirely within my acreage. Silver Pines had no basis for the 18-foot encroachment claim, and its demand that I remove or relocate the structure was denied. Their enforcement expenses tied to that claim were denied as well. I should have felt finished right there. Months earlier, that was everything I wanted. Keep the barn. Keep working. Make the notices stop. But the survey line did not end when it cleared my building. The judge turned to our counterclaim. That leaves the improvements on the opposite side of this dispute. Lauren displayed the survey again. Mark's verified line crossed association landscaping, clipped the parking area, continued through part of the patio, and entered the clubhouse footprint. Silver Pine's attorney argued that the encroachment appeared to originate from a development-era surveying error and asked the court to avoid any remedy that would unnecessarily disrupt homeowners. Lauren agreed that tearing into a functioning clubhouse was not our objective. "Mr. Mercer wants his title recognized and the encroachment resolved lawfully," she said. That mattered to me. I had spent my life fixing equipment, not looking for ways to make somebody else's property useless. The clubhouse served families who had nothing to do with Cynthia's decision to sue me. I wanted the line corrected, my land respected, and the financial burden of solving their mistake placed where it belonged. The judge ordered the parties to negotiate a resolution consistent with the established boundary and retain jurisdiction over the title and encroachment issues. Outside the courtroom, Cynthia's attorney approached Lauren before we reached the stairs. His tone was completely different from the letters that had demanded my barn come down. Silver Pines wanted to discuss purchasing the affected strip or obtaining permanent property rights sufficient to preserve the clubhouse and related improvements. Lauren told him all proposals would need accurate legal descriptions and fair terms. Cynthia stood several feet away, holding the same leather folder she had carried to my barn. She finally looked at me. "You understand this clubhouse belongs to the community." "I understand," I said. "That is why I am not asking you to move it." She seemed surprised. "Then what do you want?" I thought about the legal notices, the 18-foot accusation, and the morning she told me property lines did not care how old a building was. "The same thing you wanted from me," I said, "for the actual property line to matter." She had no answer. Over the next 2 weeks, the negotiation became practical instead of personal. Appraisers evaluated the affected land. Mark prepared a precise legal description. Lauren rejected language that might create future ambiguity around the rest of my acreage. Silver Pines agreed that my barn was outside association jurisdiction and withdrew every related claim. The only remaining question was what they would pay to legally resolve the ground beneath their own improvements. One afternoon, I stood beside the old iron pin while Mark collected a final reference measurement. Across the grass, the clubhouse looked exactly as it always had. Stone walls, trimmed shrubs, clean patio. Nothing visible had changed. But Cynthia had sued me because she trusted a line on a development map. Now Silver Pines was preparing to pay for the difference between that line and the one that had been waiting in the ground all along. The settlement conference took place 3 weeks later, and for the first time since the dispute began, nobody brought a photograph of my barn. The conference table was covered instead with Mark's certified survey, appraisal reports, title documents, and a new legal description showing the exact portion of my acreage occupied by Silver Pines improvements. The affected strip was not enormous compared with my 8.7 acres, but its location made it valuable. It supported part of the clubhouse footprint, patio, landscaping, and access near the parking area. Silver Pines could not simply pretend the mistake was harmless. Lauren made my position clear from the beginning. I would not surrender uncertain rights over the rest of my property. I would not accept language that placed my barn under association control, and I would not sign another vague boundary description that might create the same argument 10 years later. If Silver Pines wanted permanent rights beneath its improvements, the documents would identify exactly what land was involved. Cynthia sat across from me while the attorneys worked through each term. She spoke less than I had ever heard her speak at an association meeting. At one point, their attorney proposed a broad easement extending beyond the clubhouse area. Lauren slid the paper back. No. Mark then traced the verified line and the affected footprint with a pencil. This is the area the survey supports. The final agreement followed that measurement. Silver Pines withdrew its lawsuit and acknowledged that my barn stood entirely on my property, outside the disputed common buffer. The association released every enforcement claim connected to the barn and agreed to cover the negotiated portion of my legal and surveying expenses. In return, I granted precisely defined permanent property rights over the section necessary for the existing clubhouse improvements, with compensation based on the appraisal and restrictions preventing those rights from expanding into the rest of my acreage. Most important to me, the corrected boundary information and legal description would be formally recorded. There would be no more heavy line on a development map pretending my land ended somewhere it did not. When the documents were signed, Cynthia closed her folder and looked at me. This could have been settled months ago. I remembered her standing outside my barn at 6:40 in the morning telling me that property lines did not care about age. It could have, I said. Before the lawsuit, a notice explaining the settlement went to Silver Pines homeowners soon afterward. It did not use dramatic language. It said a historical boundary discrepancy had been confirmed and resolved, and that association records would be corrected. But neighbors understood what had happened. The board had spent money trying to prove my barn crossed onto their property, only to discover that their clubhouse occupied mine. At the next election, Cynthia did not remain president. I never asked whether she stepped aside voluntarily or simply understood that the neighborhood wanted different leadership. Either way, her white sport utility vehicle stopped making those slow passes by my gravel driveway. Mark returned one cool morning to complete the final recorded survey work. I walked with him to the old iron pin. Honeysuckle still curled around the brush nearby, and the metal looked as ordinary as it had when my father pointed it out decades earlier. Mark checked the reference one last time. The receiver chirped. Same corner, same bearing, same line. Back at the barn, I picked up my impact wrench and returned to a mower deck that had been waiting on the workbench. The tool rattled through the old red building, sharp and familiar. Through the open doors, beyond the grass and trees, I could see the clubhouse roof in the distance. It was still standing. So was my barn. The difference was that now everyone knew exactly whose land was whose, and there was a recorded survey to make sure nobody could conveniently forget it again. By early fall, the argument that had consumed my summer had become something I could see without feeling the need to stop and study it. The corrected survey was recorded. The legal description was settled. Silver Pines had the property rights it needed for the existing clubhouse improvements, and I had written protection for everything outside that precisely defined area. My barn remained exactly where my father had built it, except for newer doors, better wiring, and decades of repairs I had made with my own hands. Most mornings began the way they had before Cynthia ever arrived with that development map. I unlocked the red doors before sunrise, switched on the work lights, and let the smell of steel, old lumber, hydraulic fluid, and coffee settle into the day. The difference was the silence outside. No association vehicle waiting on the gravel. No certified notices. No warnings about 18 feet of land that had never belonged to Silver Pines in the first place. The new board contacted me once after Cynthia left the presidency. Their representative was polite and practical. He wanted to confirm that the recorded agreement matched the final survey and asked whether I had concerns about landscaping near the property rights area. I told him I only wanted everyone to respect the recorded line. That was all I had wanted from the beginning. A few weeks later, I saw families using the clubhouse patio during a neighborhood event. Children carried paper cups across the grass while adults sat beneath the covered section near the stone wall. I felt no satisfaction from imagining that building removed. Those people had not drawn the wrong development line. They had not filed the lawsuit. The fair result was never destruction. It was correction. Silver Pines paid to resolve the mistake. The records now reflected reality, and nobody could use the old map against my acreage again. One Saturday morning, Mark stopped by while passing through the area. I was working on an older tractor inside the barn. He walked to the western corner with me, and we found the iron pin beneath the same patch of honeysuckle. I brushed dirt away with the toe of my boot. My father treated that little piece of metal like it was part of the family, I said. Mark smiled. Monuments tend to become important when people stop looking for them. That sentence stayed with me. Cynthia had arrived believing authority lived inside a leather folder and a professional-looking map. I had almost believed her because the paperwork looked official and the lawsuit made the claim feel even more official. But confidence could not move an iron monument. A board vote could not change a deed bearing. And a heavy line printed across a development plan could not become a property boundary simply because everyone had relied on it long enough. Late that afternoon, I finished the tractor repair and rolled my tools back into their drawers. The impact wrench gave one final metallic rattle before I disconnected the air line. Sunlight came through the open barn doors and caught the faded red siding. Beyond the field, the clubhouse roof was visible between the trees. Both buildings were still standing. That felt right. I walked outside and looked toward the old survey corner. Months earlier, Cynthia had stood on my gravel driveway and told me that property lines did not care how old my barn was. She was right, and in the end, that was exactly why I won. Silver Pines sued me to prove my barn crossed their line. The survey proved their clubhouse crossed mine. They came looking for 18 feet of my building, and all they accomplished was finally measuring their own.